The letter came on a Tuesday, and the paper was cheaper than any paper the house had known, and the seal was not a seal, but a smear of common wax pressed down with the flat of a thumb, and the hand that had written the direction was not her husband's hand, though it wished very much to be mistaken for it. Alowan Marchcroft took the letter from the boy at the gate and paid him a copper he could ill afford to refuse, and she did not open it in the yard where the geese might see her face change, nor in the kitchen where old Bettons would have known within a breath, but carried it up the narrow back stair to the linen room, where the light came in slantwise across the folded sheets. And there she broke the wax and read. It said what such letters had said for 18 months. It said that Captain Marchcroft was well, and much occupied with the affairs of the Eastern Column, and could not yet be spared, and sent his duty to his wife, and would write more fully when the season allowed. It was signed with his name in a hand that was almost, but not quite, his. She folded it 3 times, as she folded all his letters, and she put it in the small brass-cornered box on the shelf beside the others, and she closed the box, and she went down to see to the bread. That is where this story begins, though the beginning of it lay 4 years earlier, in a hall lit for a marriage, and the true beginning lay further back still, in a debt her father had signed and forgotten and died of, and to understand the price she paid, you must first understand the debt. But we shall come to that in its hour. For now, hold only the letter in the brass-cornered box, and the woman who did not weep over it, and the fact which she did not yet know, and which the house did not yet know, and which the village of Helneth did not yet know, that on the day that letter was written, her husband had been 3 miles away on the far side of the ridge, sitting to a fitting for a new coat. She was 26 that autumn, and had been a wife for 4 years, and a widow, in every way but the naming of it for the last 2. The house she kept was not her house. It had been her husband's grandmother's, and then her husband's uncle's, and then her husband's, and it had been promised to her upon the marriage in the plain and binding way such things were promised in those parts, which is to say by a spoken word before 3 witnesses, and a line ruled in the estate book. The estate book was kept by the steward Varon Occam, a small, tidy, tired man who had spent 30 years apologizing for the ambitions of others, and had none left of his own, and it was Varon who brought Alowan her allowance on the 1st of each month, counted out in coin upon the parlor table, and it was Varon who took away, at the end of each month, the paper on which she had accounted for its use. He was scrupulous. He was polite. He was so polite that a shrewder woman, or a less exhausted one, might have wondered why a man who had nothing to hide should trouble to hide it so carefully. Alowan did not wonder. She had learned young that suspicion is a coat that never quite fits a poor woman, and she had put the coat away in the same drawer as her mourning gloves and her mother's silver thimble, and she did not take it out. She had married Alaric Marchcroft in the spring of her 22nd year, and she had married him for the plainest reason a girl of her sort could have. Her father, dying, had signed a paper he did not read, and the paper had made a debt of the farm, and the debt had made a wife of the daughter. This is not a thing anyone said aloud. What was said aloud, at the wedding, was that Captain Marchcroft had done the Helneth farm a great kindness in taking a bride out of it without a portion, and that Alowan Ware, as she had been, was fortunate in her husband, and pretty enough for the country, if not for the town, and would no doubt learn in time to carry herself as the mistress of a good house should. She had listened to all of it standing very straight in a dress 2 sizes too grand for her, and she had thought, with the calm that had always stood in her instead of tears, that she would learn to carry herself, since carrying was a thing she had learned to do well, and that the rest of it, the fortune, the kindness, the prettiness, was other people's business, and no concern of hers. He had been kind to her, in the first year. Not warm, he was not a warm man, but kind in the manner of a man who has bought a horse and means to feed it properly. He had shown her the accounts, and taught her the names of the tenants, and stood by her at the harvest supper with his hand at her elbow, and once, on a wet November evening, he had sat by the fire opposite her and read aloud for an hour from a book of sermons, and she had thought. She had let herself think, which was a mistake she did not make twice, that she might yet be happy. Then the war had come in the spring of the second year, and he had gone, as gentlemen of his rank went, at the head of a small company raised from the ridge villages. And he had written from the coast, and from the eastern column, and from the winter quarters, and the letters had grown shorter, and the intervals between them longer, and then, in the autumn of the third year, the letters had begun to arrive in a hand that was almost, but not quite, his. Aloin had noted the change. She had said nothing of it. She had told herself, and had failed to believe herself, that a man in a camp writes as he can, and that a hand grows tired, and that ink is not the man. She had told herself this for 1.5 years, and she was telling herself still. On the Tuesday, the cheap letter came, when she folded it 3 times and put it in the box. Now, at the same hour on the far side of the ridge, in a market town called Fahrenholt, where nobody knew the Marchcrofts, and where the tailor had a good reputation for a modest price, Captain Alaric Marchcroft stood on a low stool in his shirt sleeves, while a boy with a mouthful of pins turned him slowly in the light. He was a handsome man in the way of men who have never had to be anything else, and he was in that moment as pleased with himself as he had ever been in his life, which was saying a great deal, for he had been pleased with himself, in one continuous unbroken chord, for 37 years. The coat that was being fitted to him was blue, of a blue that was not the blue of any regiment, and it was to be worn in 3 weeks at his wedding to a young woman named Isor Vensley, who believed him to be a widower, and whose father believed him to be a widower, and whose father's bank believed him to be a widower, and who was, on the strength of that belief, prepared to settle upon him at the altar a sum of money sufficient to pay off certain gentlemen in the eastern capital whose patience had begun to fray. He had not told Aloin. He did not intend to tell Aloin. He had, in fact, arranged matters so that Aloin would not be told by anyone, since the wedding was to be a quiet one at a country chapel some 14 miles from Halneth, at the estate of a friend of Isor's father, and the guests were to be drawn exclusively from a set of people whose paths had never in their lives crossed the paths of the Halneth tenants. He had thought it through as carefully as he thought anything through, which was not very carefully at all, and he had assured himself, in the manner of men who assure themselves of things because otherwise they would have to stop, that the arrangement was, on the whole, kinder to everyone than the truth would have been. He had said as much aloud, over brandy, to the steward Baron Occam, who had received the confidence with a bow an inch too shallow, and had said only, in the flat voice he kept for facts, "As you wish, sir," and had gone home that night and sat a long while at his own hearth, with his hands folded on his knees, listening to the small, hard ticking of the clock, and thinking of a paper he had signed once, and of a girl at Halneth who did not deserve what the paper had cost her, though he could not, at his age, imagine any way to say so aloud. The house at Halneth kept its work. The bread went into the oven, the geese were driven up from the pond, the last apples of the season were laid in the loft between straw, and Aloin laid them there herself, one by one, choosing the sound ones and setting aside the bruised. She was a woman known in the village for 3 things, and it is by these 3 things that we shall know her, since the world had not, so far, thought her worth knowing by any other. She was known for paying the doctor's bill of old Marin, the shepherd, out of her own allowance in the winter he coughed blood, and for refusing to be thanked for it. She was known for going herself to the mill when the miller cheated Widow Cabell of half a sack, and for standing in the mill door until the half sack was returned, and for the level look with which she had returned the miller's stare, which the miller had afterward described, at the tavern, as the look of a woman who had counted him out to the last farthing and found him wanting. And she was known for the way she read the account book aloud to Bettins on the first Sunday of every month, sitting at the kitchen table with Bettins beside her, because Bettins could not read, and because Bettins had a right, as the oldest living servant of the house, to know that no coin had been wasted upon her mistress's vanity. These were not large things. They were the things her world penalized in a woman, paying debts that were not hers, defending strangers who could not defend themselves, sharing knowledge that others thought a mistress had no obligation to share. She did them because she did not know how to do otherwise, and she did not know how to do otherwise because her mother, dying, had said to her, "Eloin, the poor watch us the way we watch the sky for weather. Do not be cruel weather to them." And Eloin had kept the sentence as another woman keeps a locket, and she took it out sometimes at night and turned it in her mind until it shone. She believed, still, on the Tuesday, the cheap letter came, that her husband was in the East. She believed it, because to believe otherwise would have been to look into a room she had walked past all her life without opening. And there are rooms, in every marriage of that sort, whose doors are not so much shut as painted over, and one must take a knife to the paint before one can find the handle. She had not yet taken up the knife. She would take it up before the month was out. But first there was the bread, and the apples, and the geese, and the letter in the box, and the small brown moth that circled the lamp in the linen room as she went out and closed the door behind her, and the fact which the audience now holds, and which she does not, and which is the whole engine of what follows, that at the very hour she was folding his letter for the third time, her husband was being measured for the coat in which he meant to marry another woman. The steward Baron Occam came on the first of the month, as he always came, and set the coin upon the parlor table in 4 small stacks, as he always said it, and took the paper of accounts from Eloin's hand, and read it through, and folded it, and put it in the leather satchel he had carried for 30 years. And he stood then a moment longer than he needed to stand, with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Mrs. Marchcroft, if I may, the captain sends his particular respects, and hopes you are well." He had said this every month for 18 months. He said it now with a small alteration of tone, so small that a woman not listening for it would not have heard it, an alteration in the direction of pity, or of shame, and Eloin, who had been not listening for anything in particular, heard it in spite of herself, and looked up from the coin, and looked at Varon, and Varon looked at the carpet. "Thank you, Miss Occam," she said, in the even voice she kept for such moments. "Pray tell him, when next you write, that I am well, and that the house is well, and that the tenants are well, and that we all shall be glad to see him home." Varon bowed. It was a bow an inch too shallow, and a half-breath too long, and he went out. Eloin sat a while at the parlor table with the 4 small stacks of coin before her, and she did not touch them. She was thinking, for the first time in 18 months, about how a man writes when he is tired. She was thinking about how a man's hand changes, and how a man's hand does not change, and about the smear of common wax on a cheap letter, and about the fact that a captain of an Eastern column would not, in the ordinary way of the service, be writing on such paper. She was thinking, without wishing to think it, about a room whose door had been painted over. And she stood up, at last, and she gathered the coin into her apron, and she went to put it in the small brass-cornered box on the shelf, and when she opened the box to put the coin in, she looked at the 18 folded letters lying in it, and she took out the last 3. And she carried them to the window, and she read them in the light, and she saw, for the first time, that the hand that had written them was not her husband's hand, and had never been her husband's hand, and she stood at the window a long while with the letters in her hand, and she did not weep. She had not wept when her father died, and she had not wept at her wedding, and she did not weep now. She folded the letters, and she put them back in the box, and she went down to the kitchen and asked Bettens for a cup of hot water with a slice of lemon in it, because she had a chill she wished to be rid of, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands around the cup, and she said, "Half to Bettens and half to the wall. Bettens, when did the captain last send word by his own hand?" And Bettens, who was chopping onions, and who had been waiting 18 months to be asked such a question, and who had been afraid to volunteer the answer, put down her knife and wiped her hands and sat down opposite her mistress and said, "Ma'am, if you want the truth of it, I have not seen his hand upon a letter since the summer before last." And Aloan said, "That is what I thought." And Bettens said, "Ma'am," and did not finish. And Aloan said, "It is all right, Bettens, you have not lied to me. Only the letters have. And letters are, on the whole, easier to answer than people." We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. A truth, once seen, is a difficult guest to turn out of a house. Aloan sat with hers for 2 days, and she did not speak of it, not to Bettens, not to the vicar, not to the tenants who came to the door with the small business of the season. She let the truth stand in the corner of every room she entered, and she nodded to it as one nods to a relation one does not care for but cannot deny. And she went on with the work of the house, and she thought. She had been taught, by a father who had been ruined by acting quickly, to act only after she had counted the room, and she counted now. She counted the 18 letters in the box, and the 18 small alterations of Varen's tone, and the 4 years since her marriage, and the 2 years since her husband had last set foot in Helnith, and she counted the tenants who depended upon the house, and the servants who depended upon the tenants, and she counted, last, the promise she had made her mother about cruel weather, and she found, at the end of the counting, that she had no right to act for herself alone in this matter, because the matter was not hers alone. If her husband was not in the East, then her husband was somewhere, and if her husband was somewhere, then the somewhere had a name, and if the somewhere had a name, then it had, in all likelihood, a purpose, and the purpose, given what she knew of her husband, would concern money, and if the purpose concerned money, then the tenants and the servants would in the end be paid for it. She did not know yet that the payment had already been arranged, and that the coin was to be Isor Vensley's dowry, and that the receipt was to be a second marriage in a country chapel 14 miles from her own door. But she knew enough to know that she must know more, and she knew enough to know that she would not learn more by asking Varen Occam, who would only bow an inch too shallow and give her back her own words in a flatter voice. So on the 3rd morning she put on her plain gray traveling cloak, and she took from the brass-cornered box the smallest of the 3 cheap letters, and she walked the 4 miles to Helnith village, and she went to the door of a house at the end of the lane, where a woman named Mara Threp had lived for 40 years, and was known to write letters for those who could not write their own. Mara Threp was 72, and had buried 3 husbands and outlived 2 of her children, and she had a tongue that could take the varnish off a table, and a heart that had, in 72 years, refused only one thing anyone asked of it, and that had been a request from a man now dead to lie about a will. Aloan sat at Mara's kitchen table and put the letter down between them and said, "Mara, whose hand is this?" And Mara Threp, who had been dandling a cat, put the cat down and took up the letter and held it to the window and turned it once and set it down and said, "That is Corny Withel's hand, and Corny Withel writes for money in Fahrenholt, and I could tell you the tavern he drinks his money at, and I could tell you the man he most often writes for. Though I will not tell you the last unless you tell me first why you are asking." And Eloin said, "Because the man he most often writes for is, I believe, my husband." And Merathrep looked at her a long moment, and she said, in a voice that was not soft but was not hard either, "Then, my dear, you had better sit still, for I have been afraid of this hour for a 12-month, and I would rather tell it slowly than badly." And she told it slowly. She told Eloin that Alaric Marchcroft had been seen at Farrenholt 7 times in the past year that Mara knew of, and no doubt many more that she did not, and that he was known there under his own name, and that he kept company there with a family called Vensley, who were in trade in a large way in the eastern capital, and who had a daughter of 19 named Isor, and that Isor Vensley was to be married in 3 weeks in a country chapel at the Vensley estate at Prattlemere to a gentleman whom the Vensleys believed to be a widower of good family, and that the gentleman was Alaric Marchcroft, and that Merathrep had known this for a month and had not slept well for a month, and that she had come 3 times to the edge of the Helnath Road to walk to the house and tell Eloin, and had turned back 3 times because she had not known what a woman could do with such a thing once she was told, and that she was sorry, and that she was old, and that she would say what she had said again to any face that was needed, at any hour, at any door. And Eloin sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not weep, and she did not stand up, and she did not raise her voice, and she said only, when Mara had finished, "Mara, will you write for me a letter to the housekeeper at Prattlemere, and ask her, in a woman's plain words, whether the household requires an extra pair of hands for the wedding of Miss Vensley, since a girl of my acquaintance in Helnath is in want of a place?" And Merathrep looked at her for a long, slow moment, and she said, "Eloin Marchcroft, you are your mother's daughter to the last stitch." And Eloin said, "I hope so." And Mara wrote the letter, and Eloin carried it home, and posted it that afternoon, and the answer came back within a week, and the answer said that yes, the household at Prattlemere would be glad of an extra pair of hands on the evening of the 18th, and that the girl was to present herself at the servants' door at 4 o'clock in a clean apron, and would be paid 1 shilling and 6 for the night's work. Now, there is a thing that must be said here before the 18th arrives about what Eloin Marchcroft chose, and why. She did not choose to write to her husband. She had considered it on the night after Merathrep's kitchen, and she had rejected it for reasons that were plain to her, though they would not, perhaps, have been plain to a woman of a different sort. She did not write because a letter could be denied, and could be burned, and could be answered with another letter in Corny Whittle's hand, and could be, in the end, 1 more folded paper in the brass-cornered box. She did not choose to go to the magistrate, because the magistrate at Helnath was Alaric Marchcroft's cousin, and would have received her charge with the same bow an inch too shallow that she had learned to hate on Baron Occam's shoulders. She did not choose to go to the vicar, because the vicar was a good man and a frightened one, and the frightened do not stand between a captain and his second bride at 3 weeks' notice. She did not choose to go to Isor Vensley, because she did not yet know Isor Vensley, and it seemed to her, on reflection, that a 19-year-old girl who had been told she was marrying a widower ought not to be told she was not by a stranger in a letter, but by the sight of the widow herself, standing in the room in a plain apron, with a tray in her hands, and no possible mistake about who she was. She chose, that is to say, to be present. She chose the oldest form of witness the world has ever known, which is the form in which the wronged party stands in the room and lets the room see her, and lets the wrongdoer see her, and lets the wrongdoer's new fortune see her, and does not raise her voice, and does not raise her hand, and lets the truth do its own weight lifting in the silence she creates by walking in. It was, she thought, the only form of address that could not be answered by a forged letter. And it was, she thought, the form that would spare Isor Vensley the most. Because Isor Vensley would see with her own eyes and would not have to be persuaded by anyone else's, and would be at liberty to decide what she thought of what she saw, at her own pace, in her own light. Aloan did not know Isor, but she remembered being 19 and being handed a paper her father had signed and being told, without being asked, what her life was to be, and she thought that a girl of 19 deserved, at the least, to be asked. The 18th was a Thursday, and the weather was fine, and the road from Halneth to Prattlemere ran up over the ridge and down through a chestnut wood and past a village called Menning, where the smith stood in his doorway and touched his cap to Elowen as she passed, though he could not have said, afterward, why he had touched his cap to a young woman on foot in a plain cloak with a bundle at her side, unless it were that she had walked past him with the carriage of a person going into a battle she had already decided to win. She had left the house at daybreak, on foot, having told Bettons only that she was going to Menning on business of the house and would be back on the morrow, and she had told no one else, and had taken with her only the plain apron, and a clean cap, and the smallest of the 3 cheap letters folded inside her stays, and the estate book of Halneth, which she had wrapped in oilcloth and carried at the bottom of her bundle. Because she had learned young that a woman going into any room where money was to change hands should carry with her the record of every coin she had ever handled, since the record was the only voice her sort of woman was reliably permitted to raise. She reached Prattlemere at 3 and washed her face at the pump in the yard, and presented herself at the servants' door at 4, and was received by a stout, kind woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who looked her up and down and pronounced her clean and quiet and likely to give no trouble, and set her to polishing glasses in the pantry off the great hall, and told her that when the guests went in to supper she was to carry a tray of wine and stand at the second sideboard and pour when asked and not before, and that if any gentleman spoke to her she was to answer him sir and no more, and that if the bride's mother spoke to her she was to curtsy and answer yes ma'am and no more, and that if she did all these things faithfully she should have her 1 and 6 at midnight, and a slice of the wedding cake to carry home. Aloan said, yes ma'am, and curtsied, and set to polishing glasses, and did not lift her eyes to the great hall until she was called. The company came in at 7. The candles were lit, and the fires were built high, for the evening was cool, and Isor Vensley entered on her father's arm in a dress the color of new cream, and Alaric Marchcroft stood at the head of the room in the blue coat that was not the blue of any regiment, and Aloan Marchcroft stood at the second sideboard with a tray of wine in her hands, and she looked at the man she had married 4 years ago, in a hall lit for a marriage, and the man she had married did not see her, because the man she had married had never in his life looked properly at a woman with a tray. Isor Vensley took her seat at the long table, and the toast was proposed by her father, and the company drank, and Isor smiled the small, strained smile of a girl who has been told all her life to smile at strangers, and Alaric smiled the easy smile of a man to whom the world had always given what he asked for, and Elowen stood at the sideboard and waited to be called. She had been called 4 times, and had poured 4 times, and had said sir 4 times and yes, ma'am twice, before it was her turn to pour for the head of the table. She crossed the hall with the tray. She crossed slowly, because she had been taught by her mother that a woman with wine in her hands walks slowly, or does not walk at all. She reached the head of the table, and she stood at Alaric's right shoulder, and she said, in the even voice she kept for such moments, "Sir, will you take wine?" And Alaric Marchcroft, who had been in the middle of a witticism directed at his new father-in-law, half turned his head and lifted his glass without looking at her, and said, "Fill it, girl." And Aloan filled it, and set the bottle back on the tray, and did not move. She stood at his shoulder with the tray in her hands, and she did not move, and after a moment, Alaric, who had a countryman's instinct for the presence of anything that was not moving when it should have moved, turned his head again, and looked at her, and the wine in his glass shook once, very slightly, and steadied, and he set the glass down with the care of a man setting down a live coal, and he said, in a voice that was almost his and not quite, "Eloin and Isor Vensley." At his other shoulder, in the dress the color of new cream, looked up from her plate, and looked at the servant, and looked at her bridegroom, and looked at the servant again, and said, in a small clear voice that carried the whole length of the table, "Sir, do you know this woman?" The table did not go silent all at once. It went silent in the way a field goes silent when a hawk crosses it, one conversation at a time, moving outward from the head, each guest hearing a hush at their neighbor's mouth, and falling silent in turn out of the pure instinct of the herd. By the time the silence reached the foot of the table, 32 people were looking at the head of it, and at the servant standing at the captain's shoulder with a tray in her hands, and at the bride in the cream-colored dress with her small clear question hanging in the air between them. Alaric did not answer at once. He sat with his hand upon the stem of the glass and his eyes upon the tablecloth, and Eloin, standing beside him with the tray, could see the pulse in his throat count itself out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And she counted with him, and at the 5th beat he lifted his head, and he looked at Isor, and he said, "She is a woman from the Halneth country. I have known her people. I did not expect to see her here." And Isor Vensley, whom he had chosen for her dowry and not for her wits, and had thereby made the ordinary mistake of his sort, looked at him with a 19-year-old's steady, untrained gaze, and said, "That is not what I asked, sir." And Aloan, who had rehearsed nothing, and who had walked 4 miles at daybreak and 8 miles the day before, and had polished glasses for 3 hours, and had said "sir" 4 times, and had come to the head of a table she had no right in law or custom to stand at, set the tray down upon the sideboard behind her without turning her head, and she put her hands together at her waist, and she said, in the voice she had used to Betton's over the cup of hot water, "Miss Vensley, my name is Aloan Marchcroft. I was married to this gentleman 4 years ago last spring in the parish church of Halneth before witnesses whose names I can give you and whose signatures stand in the register still. I did not come here to shame you. I came here because I could not think of a kinder way to tell you what I have to tell you than to let you see me with your own eyes. Before any paper was signed that could not be unsigned. I ask your pardon for the manner of it. I do not ask his." There was a sound, then, from the middle of the table that was neither a gasp nor a word, but the small involuntary sound a man makes when he has been holding his breath without knowing it, and it came from Baron Occam, who had been placed by some careless hand at the 7th chair on the left, and who now stood up, very slowly, and pushed his chair back, and stood behind it with his hands on its rail, and he said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, "It is true. I have carried the letters. I have carried the coin. I have carried the lie for 18 months, and I have been paid for it, and I ask no man's forgiveness, and I make no defense. But it is true, and Mrs. Marchcroft has said it as it is, and I will say the rest of it if I am asked." Alaric did not look at him. Alaric was still looking at the tablecloth. Miss Vensley, at the foot of the table, a large, florid, careful man who had made his money by knowing when to speak and when not to, set down his knife and folded his napkin and stood up, and said, "Captain Marchcroft, be so good as to walk with me into the next room." And Alaric stood up, because there was nothing else he could do, and he walked the length of the great hall with his father-in-law that was not to be at his shoulder, and the door of the small parlor closed behind them, and the company at the table sat in the silence that followed, and did not speak, and did not eat, and did not touch their glasses, and only Isor Vensley, at the head of the table in the cream-colored dress, sat with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up, and she looked at Eloan Marchcroft standing at the sideboard, and Eloan Marchcroft looked back at her. And neither of them said anything, and the fire in the hearth behind them burned steadily on, indifferent to what it lit. It was Isor who moved first. She rose, in a manner that would have done credit to a woman twice her age, and she came round the head of the table, and she stopped in front of Eloan, and she said, quietly enough that only Eloan and the two nearest guests could hear her, "Mrs. Marchcroft, will you sit down with me? There is a small room off the hall. I would be obliged if you would sit down with me a quarter of an hour, and tell me what you know, and let me tell you what I know, and afterward I will give the company whatever answer is to be given." And Eloan, who had come prepared to be despised, and had steeled herself against every form of rage a bride might turn upon a wife, looked at the girl in the cream-colored dress, and she saw, with the small pity that overtakes the wronged when they meet the almost wronged, that Isor Vensley was not going to be cruel to her, and that Isor Vensley was not going to be cruel to herself, and that Isor Vensley was, in that moment, the most dignified person in the room, by a distance she could not have measured. And Eloan curtsied, plainly as a servant curtsies, and said, "Yes, Miss Vensley." Gladly, and the two of them walked out of the great hall together, the servant and the bride, and the small door closed behind them, and the company did not know where to look, and looked at their plates, and Mrs. Pruitt in the pantry, who had heard everything through the serving hatch, sat down on the stool by the copper and put her apron over her face and cried without a sound, because she had been in service 40 years and had seen many things, and had never before seen a young lady of quality walk out of her own wedding supper hand in hand with the wife of her betrothed. What passed in the small parlor between Eloan Marchcroft and Isor Vensley was, by the reckoning of both women afterward, the longest quarter of an hour of either of their lives. Eloan laid the estate book on the table and opened it to the page on which her marriage had been entered by her husband's own hand, in the days when he had still written his own hand, and Isor read it, and turned the page, and read the next, and asked one question, which was whether there had been any child of the marriage, and Eloan said no, there had not, and Isor nodded once, and closed the book, and sat a while with her hand upon it, and then she said, "Mrs. Marchcroft, I do not know you, and you do not know me, and I have no right to ask what I am about to ask, but I will ask it anyway, because I do not think I shall ever have a better hour to ask it in. If I stand up now and go back into that hall and tell my father that there is to be no marriage tonight or ever, will you stand beside me while I say it?" And Eloan, who had come to the house that evening with no plan beyond being seen, and who had been prepared to walk out of it a wife despised, or a wife pitied, or a wife hated, but had not been prepared to walk out of it a wife who had been asked, by the girl she had come to warn, to stand beside her in the saying of a difficult thing, felt at last, and for the first time in 18 months, and in a manner that surprised her greatly, the sting of tears at the back of her eyes, and she did not let them fall, but she said, "Miss Vensley, I will stand beside you tonight, and I will stand beside you tomorrow, and I will stand beside you every day of the next year if you need me to, for I know what it is to be 19 and to be handed a paper, and I would not have you handed one you did not choose." And Isor Vensley put out her hand, and Aloin Marchcroft took it, and they stood up together, and they went back into the hall, and Isor walked the length of the room to the door of the small parlor where her father sat with Alaric, and she knocked once and went in, and she said, in the small clear voice that had asked the first question of the evening, "Father, there is to be no wedding." "Not tonight, not to this gentleman, not ever. I have spoken with Mrs. Marchcroft, and I am satisfied of the truth of what she has told me, and I will not marry a man who has a wife, and I will not marry a man who has lied to me, and I will not marry a man who has lied to you. And I ask you to send the company home, and to send this gentleman with them, and to have the settlement papers brought to me, that I may see them burned before I go up to my bed." And Mr. Vensley, who loved his daughter, and who had made his money by knowing when to speak and when not to, and who had spent the last quarter of an hour saying very little to Alaric Marchcroft, and hearing a great deal from him, stood up and said, "As you wish, my dear," and went into the hall and dismissed the company with a bow, and sent Alaric from the house on foot with a servant walking behind him carrying a lantern to see that he did not turn back, and had the settlement papers brought from the study, and stood beside his daughter while she burned them one by one in the parlor fire, and when the last was ash, he turned to Eloin Marchcroft, who was standing at the door with her plain cloak over her arm, and he said, "Mrs. Marchcroft, my house is yours tonight, and my carriage is yours tomorrow, and my counsel is yours as long as you require it. I have been made a fool of in the same measure as my daughter, and there is no shame in her for it, nor in you, and any shame there is I will bear on the gentleman's behalf, for he does not seem, at present, to be equal to the carrying of it himself." And Aloin thanked him, and curtsied plainly as a wife curtsies to a father, and said that she would sit up an hour with Miss Vensley if Miss Vensley wished it, and Miss Vensley did wish it, and the two of them sat by the parlor fire until 2 in the morning, and did not say a great deal, but sat and looked at the fire, and once Isor laid her head against Aloin's shoulder, and slept a little, and Aloin did not move, because she had learned young that when the young at last consent to sleep upon your shoulder, you do not move, no matter what your own bones are doing. The following weeks did the work that weeks do. Alaric Marchcroft did not return to Halneth. He wrote once from a coast town, in his own hand this time, a letter that Aloin read through once and then folded 3 times and put in the brass-cornered box with the others, because she had learned by then that a letter was a letter, and the box was where letters lived. He asked her pardon in phrases he had clearly rehearsed, and he said that he did not intend to trouble her further, and he said that certain gentlemen in the eastern capital were pressing him for certain sums, and that he did not know how the sums were to be paid, and that he supposed she would hear of him next, if she heard of him at all, from wherever the pressing gentleman finally caught him up. She did not answer the letter. She did answer the letter that came, a week later, from Mr. Vensley, who wrote to say that certain gentlemen in the eastern capital had been paid by him in full, on condition that they trouble Captain Marchcroft no further, and that Captain Marchcroft, in gratitude for this consideration, had signed a paper renouncing all claim upon the Halneth estate in favor of his wife, and that the paper was legally binding in every court in the county, and that a copy would arrive by the next post, and that she was, from the date of that letter, mistress of Halneth in her own right, and answerable to no one for it, and that this arrangement was made not as a kindness to her, for Mr. Vensley was too honest a man to call by the name of kindness what he had done at least partly to close a wound in his own household, but as a matter of common justice, since the estate had been kept for 18 months by her hand and by her thrift, and belonged to her, in equity if not in law, by every reckoning he knew. She read the letter twice, and she folded it, and she put it in the brass-cornered box, and she went down to Bettens in the kitchen, and she said, "Bettens, sit down." And Bettens sat down, and Aloin said, "The house is ours." And Bettens, who had scrubbed the floors of that house for 41 years, and who had never once in her life said the word ours of any roof over her head, put her hands over her mouth, and did not cry, because her mistress did not cry, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table a long while together, and did not speak. And the small brown moth that had circled the lamp in the linen room came in through the open door and circled the kitchen lamp instead, and Bettens said, "At last, ma'am, will you take a cup of hot water with a slice of lemon in it? For I have a chill I wish to be rid of." And Aloin laughed. It was the first laugh, in that kitchen, in 18 months, and it was a small, dry laugh, but Bettens afterwards said it was the sweetest sound she had heard in her life, and she was 73 and had heard a great many. Baron Occam was dismissed from the service of the estate on the morning after the 18th by the hand of Mr. Vensley, who had been given the office by Eloin at her request, since she did not wish, she said, to look at Baron Occam's face across the parlor table on the 1st of the month for the rest of her life, and Baron went home to his cottage at the edge of the village, and sat by his own hearth, and did not go out again for a week, and when he did go out, he went to the churchyard, and stood a long while at the grave of his wife, who had been dead 19 years, and he said aloud, to her, what he had never said aloud to anyone in life, which was that he had signed a paper once for a captain, and had been paid for it, and had known it was wrong at the time, and had done it because he was afraid of what a man of that rank could do to a man of his, and that he had gone on doing it because a first cowardice makes a second easy, and a second a third, and that he was sorry, and that he was old, and that he would live out his days in the village quietly, and would not ask for pity, and would not accept any if it were offered. He was not offered any. But when old Marin the shepherd died that winter, and left no one to see to his sheep, it was Baron Occam who walked up the hill in the snow to fold them, and did not tell anyone, and did not stop doing it, and the village noted the fact, and did not speak of it, and did not, in the end, hold his old cowardice against him, with quite the same coldness it might otherwise have kept. Though it did not forgive him either, and he did not ask it to. He died 4 years afterward, of a chill taken on the hill, and Aloin paid for his stone, and had cut on it only his name and his dates, and the words he did what he could at the last, which was as much as she was willing to promise for him, and as little as she was willing to withhold. Isor Vensley came to Halneth in the spring after the 18th, and came again in the summer, and came again in the autumn, and in the second spring after she came to stay a season. And in the third she brought with her a young man from her father's counting house, whom she meant to marry, and did marry, in the parish church at Halneth, with Eloin Marchcroft standing at her shoulder in the place of a mother, since Isor's own mother had died when Isor was 7, and Isor had said, plainly, that if she was to be married at all, she wished to be married from the house of the woman who had saved her from the wrong marriage, and Eloin had said that Halneth was her house, and Isor was welcome in it. And the young man from the counting house turned out to be a decent, quiet, careful person, who loved Isor without display, and was loved by her without display, and the two of them settled in the eastern capital, and had, in the fullness of time, 3 children, the eldest of whom was a girl, and was named Eloin, and grew up calling the mistress of Halneth aunt, though there was no blood between them, and preferring, when she was old enough to choose, to spend her summers at Halneth rather than in the eastern capital, and learning there, from her aunt, how to keep a book of accounts, and how to speak to a miller who had shorted a widow, and how to sit still in a room where a difficult thing was being said, and how, When the young at last consent to sleep upon your shoulder, you do not move. Alaric Marchcroft was heard of once more, 5 years afterward, from a port town on the southern coast, where he had lived, it was said, in reduced circumstances, and had died of a fever contracted in a lodging-house, and had been buried in the parish ground there at the parish's expense, and Aloin, when she was told, sat a long while at the parlor table with her hands folded, and then she went up to the linen room, and she took down the brass-cornered box, and she took out the 18 folded letters, and the one letter in his own hand, and she carried them down to the kitchen, and she opened the stove, and she put them in the fire one by one, and she watched them burn, and she did not weep, and she did not smile, and when the last was ash, she closed the stove, and she said aloud, to no one, there that is done. God rest him, for I cannot. And Bettens, who had been kneading bread at the far end of the table, said only, Amen, ma'am, and went on kneading, and did not look up. Mara Threpp lived to be 91, and died in her own bed in the lane at Halneth, with Eloin sitting beside her holding her hand, and her last words were, Eloin Marchcroft, you are your mother's daughter to the last stitch, which were the same words she had said the first day, and Eloin bent and kissed her forehead, and closed her eyes, and paid for her stone, and had cut on it the words Mara had once cut on her own mother's stone, which were, she wrote for those who could not write, and she told the truth for those who could not tell it, and there were 50 people at her burial, and half of them owed her a letter. There is a paragraph that must be written here, because the story would be a lie without it, and lies are the thing this story has been about from the beginning. Not everything came right. The 4 years Aloin Marchcroft was married to Alaric were not restored to her. The letters she had written to a man who was not reading them were not returned. Her father, who had signed the paper that made a wife of his daughter, remained dead, and did not live to see her mistress of the house he had signed her into. Old Marin the shepherd, whose doctor's bill she had paid the winter he coughed blood, remained dead, and did not live to see the winter Varin Occam folded his sheep for him in the snow. The child Eloin had once, in the first year of her marriage, permitted herself to hope for, did not come, either then or afterward, and she did not marry again, though she was asked twice, and gave her reasons for the refusal only to Bettens, and Bettens kept them. Some doors, she said once, to Esor's daughter, when the girl was old enough to ask, do not open a second time, and one does not stand at them weeping, but one does not pretend they are not shut. She said it plainly, and only once, and did not repeat it, and the girl remembered it all her life, and told it to her own daughter, and her daughter to hers, and so the sentence became, in the manner of such sentences, a small inheritance in that family, more durable than the silver, and more useful than the land. On the first Sunday of every month, for the rest of her life, Eloin Marchcroft sat at the kitchen table with Bettens beside her, and read aloud the account book of Halneth, coin by coin, from the first entry to the last, because Bettens could not read, and because Bettens had a right, as the oldest living servant of the house, to know that no coin had been wasted upon her mistress's vanity. When Bettens died at 84, Aloin went on doing it, reading aloud to the empty chair where Bettens had sat, because the reading was, by then, less a courtesy to Bettens than a discipline for herself, and because there is a kind of prayer that consists in the plain naming of what one has spent, and to whom, and why. And on the evening of the 18th of that month, every year, for as long as she lived, Aloin Marchcroft put on a plain apron, and stood in her own kitchen, and poured out a single glass of wine, and set it upon a tray, and carried the tray the length of the kitchen to the hearth, and set it down there, and stood a moment with her hands folded at her waist, and then she took up the glass, and drank it, and washed the glass, and put it away, and went to bed. She never told anyone why. Bettons knew. Esor knew. The girl who was named for her guessed and did not ask. It was the small recurring rite of a woman who had learned that the world can be walked into on foot, in a plain cloak, with a tray in the hands, and that a truth carried in a plain apron will outweigh a lie carried in a blue coat that is not the blue of any regiment, and that the room, when one walks into it slowly, will in the end be quiet enough to hear a single clear voice ask the one question that matters. The letter that had come on that first Tuesday, on the cheap paper, with the smear of common wax, was not in the brass-cornered box any longer, for the box itself had been given to Esor's daughter as a workbox, and had held in its time thimbles and thread and a child's first sampler, and had ended its days on a shelf in the eastern capital holding buttons, which was, Aloan thought when she heard of it, exactly the honorable end for a box that had once held 18 lies. Since a button is the plainest of all small useful things, and small useful things are what a house is finally made of. She lived to be 79. She died in the linen room, in the afternoon light that came in slantwise across the folded sheets, with her hand on Esor's daughter's hand, and her last words were spoken so quietly that only the girl heard them. And the girl, being asked afterward what they had been, said only that her aunt had said the bread. She was buried in the churchyard at Halneth, and had cut on her stone her name, and her dates, and the words, "She stood in the room," and there were 140 people at her burial, and every one of them, if asked, could have told a different story about what those 5 words meant, and every one of the stories would have been true. A person who will walk 4 miles at daybreak to stand quietly in a room where a lie is being married is worth 100 who will send a letter, and worth 1,000 who will send none, and the room, in the end, always remembers who stood in it, and forgets, in time, who sat down. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.